The next set of engineering principles that we'll look at here are chemical process control engineering principles. Now, unlike the previous two sets of engineering principles that we discussed, and also one that we're going to discuss later, there is no codified set of chemical process control engineering principles, at least that I could find. So what I've done is I've compiled a list in order to determine whether the cell embodies the engineering principles associated with chemical process control. Some of them, they do. Some of them the cell does embody, and so we'll discuss those here. So first of all, process control principle number one, you have to define your performance objective. So what are you trying to do with your system? So in order to understand how to engineer a chemical process, you have to know what is the goal. So there are common goals. You could be trying to meet product specifications, minimizing waste production, minimizing environmental impact, etc. So how does that apply to the cell? Well, each cellular pathway, has a specific function. That's true. And there's very, very little waste. But sometimes there's two functions that compete against each other, or two objectives that compete against each other. So you might have multiple competing objectives in the cell, in which case you'll have to do something called multi-optimization. So you have to do some optimization to try to meet both objectives, neither one of them perfectly, but try to meet them both together. It's with some compromise. And we'll see that a little bit later. Now, this process control principle is also very important if you're going to be studying biology, because you may take a look at a cellular pathway and you might think, you know what in the world does this even do? Or why does this particular cellular pathway have X, Y, and Z about it? And what you need to realize is that unless you know every single thing that this cellular pathway is supposed to be doing, what is its function, or what are its performance objectives, then it's really difficult to make a call as to whether it's doing what it's supposed to be doing or not. That seems obvious. Process control principle number two. Determine which of your disturbances are the most detrimental in terms of frequency, amplitude, and sensitivity. So every every chemical system that you can build, chemical engineering system, will have some susceptibility to outside disturbances. For example, if you're trying to build a chemical reactor that has to be temperature and pressure controlled, then its performance will depend on what is the ambient temperature and what is the ambient pressure. So if a storm rolls in and the ambient pressure drops a little bit, you may actually have to compensate for that. That's a disturbance. Right? And so what you want to do in process control is that you want to implement control only for the disturbances that matter most. So maybe it's very important that you keep your pressure of your reactor at 1 atm, and so you need to implement control for that. However, because of trade-offs, this means you must implement control to move your fragility to one disturbance from your detrimental disturbance to the fragility of a benign one. And so whenever you put in process control to, say, control the pressure of your reactor, that may result in fragility into something else. So what you want to do is design that so that the something else actually is not a disturbance variable that you're likely to encounter. So for example, in biology, this apparently happens all the time. In biology, there's more regulation that occurs than actual function. So more regulation that occurs than function. For example, if you look at a gene regulatory network, there are all these genes that all regulate each other, but to what purpose? Because they're just transcription factors that regulate other genes. They're not actually doing anything to the cell. And so what's going on is that the final output of a gene regulatory network may be the important thing that changes the behavior of the cell. And so what you have is all of these genetic regulatory interactions that go on upstream of that output, and they're all very important to make sure that the cell can respond in cases that you might have a disturbance variable that it encounters. Process control principle number 3, safety first. So dangerous situations should be anticipated and mitigated against. Extra measures should be implemented as fail-safes and for fault tolerance in case something goes wrong in a hazardous way. So these fail-safes should be multi-layered in case the hazardous situation prevents implementation of one or more safety measure. Now, of course, we've already talked about some of the fail-safes and fault tolerances that you can find in a cell. So things that we've already talked about like DNA, or things that we've already listed like DNA proofreading, misfolded protein disposal, misfolded protein disposal, etc. Another really good one would be an example of cancer. So in cancer develops in a cell, or a cell becomes cancerous, when you have multiple systems that have to be affected in order to cause that cell to become cancerous. So one of the first things that has to be affected would be the DNA repair mechanisms. DNA repair. Because when the DNA repair mechanisms fail, and then mutations can accumulate and you can break other things about the cell. What else has to fail about the cell? Apoptosis pathways have to fail. Because once the cell realizes that it has accumulated too many mutations and may become cancerous, then usually the apoptosis pathway gets initiated and the cell basically commits suicide. Well, that has to be derailed before cancer can develop. You also have to have signaling be affected. The signaling pathways becoming affected will cause that cell to divide out of control. Other things like cell growth, migration, so for metastatic cancer, angiogenesis, when a tumor starts to become so large that it needs to create new blood vessels to come into it so that it can still continue to get oxygen, etc., etc. So the list goes on and on and on. And so what you have is you have all these different multi-layered fail-safes in our cells, and you have to have many of these go wrong in order for cancer to develop. So most of these principles that we just talked about are the consequence of a meta-principle, that trade-offs are a fact of life. And so when you try to do one thing and protect against that, then other things are going to rear their ugly head. So for example, in a smartphone, everyone, or many people have smartphones. Most people are familiar with smartphones. In a smartphone, you want your smartphone to be very thin. Smartphone. So one of your performance objectives is that you want the smartphone to be thin. But another performance objective may be that you want your smartphone to have long battery life. Well, guess what? These two are two objectives that compete against each other. And so there are always trade-offs. If you want your phone to be too thin, or very, very thin, it will have a short battery life of necessity. If you want it to have a long battery life, then it won't be quite as thin. The same thing you can think about in cars. If you want a very, car trade-offs. If you want your car to have high horsepower, then it will also not be able to be a hybrid car because batteries don't have that. And there are multiple other trade-offs that we can think of in our everyday life. But this meta-principle doesn't apply just to the goals or performance objectives of your system. This principle also applies to the fragilities of any physical system. So there are always trade-offs, and if you put in process control in a chemical system to try to make your system robust to one particular disturbance variable, then it will be fragile to other disturbance variables. So for example, biology is very robust in the expected environment. But cells can fail miserably in an unexpected environment, and unexpected and that makes a lot of sense, right? Or if you encounter an unexpected disturbance. And that makes a lot of sense. For example, if you have a cell, or sorry, maybe a good example would be of a fish, right? A fish living in the ocean, very, very well adapted to living in salt water. Suddenly you put it into fresh water and that fish doesn't do so well, right? And so, but the fish needs all sorts of different biological pathways that make it well suited to be in this salt water, which will cause a high osmotic pressure. You put it in fresh water, and then because it has all of these adaptations to the salt water, then the fish will fail. Okay, the next set of engineering principles that we want to talk about are robot engineering principles. This is very important because cells can be thought of almost as little autonomous robots. And so that's what we're going to get to in the next video.